We are on page 85, ladies. We're going to continue our discussion of Chanukah. And we're going to go back in time. All cell phones away, please. Computers only open to blank pages. Thank you. Page 85, we're going to go right back to discover the root of Greek ideology, why it was so amazing, why it ended up becoming a challenge for the Jewish people during the time of the Second Temple in 165 BCE. And that's going to be our discussion. And what's weird is we're going to have to go back, although, of course, the whole Chanukah story and the Assyrian Greek overtaking of Israel, and particularly Jerusalem, happened after the Bible was closed, obviously. Moses had passed away outside of Israel. This is actually in Israel. This is in the time of the Second Temple. Having said all that, in order to appreciate where the Greek philosophy and ideology comes from, we have to go back as far back as Noah. So let's re-meet Noah, and let's meet his three sons, and let's get to the roots of what Greece is all about and why it ended up becoming a problem and a challenge for the Jewish people, which ended up in the Chanukah story. So let's have a look at the story of Noah. I know it sounds going far back in order to figure out what's happening at the time of the Second Temple, but we're going to pull it all together and we'll come full circle. So page 85, please look inside. We're in the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 18, Tet Yudchet to 27. And we know that Noah and his three sons and their wives and his wife, what was Noah's wife's name, by the way? Not mentioned in the Bible, but it's in the Midrash. Nope, not Zipporah. No, that was a male. Yes, what? Your last one, you said it. You did. Oh, no, that wasn't his name. His name was not sorry. And don't apologize for answering a question. The name was Naamah, actually, what's her name? And they survived the flood, and they came off the ark. And the Torah picks up the narrative from there. Look inside, please, halfway down page 85. V'yu b'nei Noach hayotzim min hateva. Do you have another book yet? And the sons of Noach came out of the Teva, out of the ark, and their names were Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Thank you so much. Shem, Ham, and Yafet were the three sons of Noah. Okay, fine. Shem, Ham, Yafet, Ham, hu Avi Canaan. Ham, it tells us, was the ancestor of the father of Canaan. Shlosha elu b'nei Noach, says the Torah. These three sons, Omele Nifsa Koloretz, ended up repopulating the entire world through their descendants. V'yachal Noach ish adama, and the first thing that Noach does is he plants a vineyard. Right, he plants a vineyard in the ground. V'yita kerem, and vines come out of it. V'yashes mina ayayin, and what he does is he made wine out of it. So the first thing he did after this very challenging 1 year on the Teva was to plant grapes in order to make wine, because he wanted to get drunk. And that's exactly what he did. Okay? We contrast that with other people in the Torah who take challenges very differently. Right? Avram Avinu was challenged, and right after his challenge of bringing his son to the Akedah and nearly dying, he decides to marry off his child. Think about the next generation. Noah, however, after the challenge that he went through, gets drunk. And while he's drunk, he's in his tent, says the Torah itself. The fact that the Torah talks about it means it's a very important part of the story. He gets naked. He's uncovered in his tent and he's drunk. It's not looking good for Noah. V'yar Cham Avi Canaan. Cham, the father of Canaan, saw this nakedness at Erevat Aviv. V'yaged l'shnei Achim. And he says to his two brothers who are outside the tent, Bachutz. And he tells them, he says, something bad's happened. V'yikach Shem v'Yafet et ha-simla. So Shem and Yafet take the simla, they take the clothing, v'yasimu al shechem, and they put it onto their shoulders, al shechem, on their shoulders, shneihem, v'yachon, and they went backwards. They walked in backwards with some form of garment to cover over Noah. Why do they walk in backwards? They don't want to embarrass their father in this state by looking at him. So they had tremendous respect for their father, and they walked in backwards with a cloak on their back. V'yikasu et ervat avim, and they covered their father. Ufneim achriyan v'ervat avim loro, and they didn't see the shame of their fathers. Shame being the English shame, S-H-A-M-E, not the shin man. V'yikatz Noach mienu, and he wakes up, right, from his drunkenness. V'yeda et asher salo bnei hakatan, he realized what the youngest son, Chama, done to him. Now, there are many opinions what exactly he done to him. Some say that he violated his own father. Some say that he wanted to make sure that there would be no more sons coming out of Noach. Yup. So he did that while he was drunk. But whatever it was, V'yomer aror Canaan, he cursed Canaan. Eved avodim yelachav, you're going to be a slave, a servant to your brothers. Okay. But that's not our concern right now. V'yomer baruch Hashem elokei Shem, and he says, wow, the God of Shem, he says, blessed be the Lord of Shem. Canaan's going to be your servant. Eved lamoy. Yafet. Now Yefet, the other son that came and protected his father, you're going to reside in the tents of shame. He says, Yefet, you did a great thing. And before you, what you did by covering me in a very modest fashion, you're going to reside in the tents of shame. We know what this means yet. And Canaan's going to be your servant. So we have three sons of Noah. We have Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Okay. Shem is mentioned first, but he's not the oldest. We have Ham, who is the son of Canaan, right? Or Canaan comes from Ham, rather. He is cursed. And Yafet, for being in collusions with Shem, he ends up being linked together with him. Shem is blessed. And Yafet is told, you did a great job. You're going to live in the tents of Shem. That's what the Torah tells us. Who is Shem and who is Yafet? So the descendants of Shem become the Jewish people, that's right. The Jews. And from Yafet, we'll see in a moment, is going to come. Let's have a look. Turn to page 86 and let's have a look. They become the Canaanites, those who end up residing in the land of Israel for the Jewish people. Bnei Yafet, the sons of Yafet are Gomer, I'm not sure who they are, Magog, well, that's going to be an interesting nation, I think we're going to meet again, Madai, the Medians, the Yavan, and Greece. The Tevel, Meshach, the Tiras. Tuval, Meshach, and Tiras. So we see coming from Yafet, in the listing the Torah itself gives us, are the Greeks. So we meet the Greeks, the Yavan, right? Yavan is Greece, remember. And we see that not so bad. Their ancestors did some great deed. We're not sure why it's so incredible. It's a great deed. His descendants end up becoming rewarded for this action. And we're told that your descendants are going to reside in the tents of shame. What happened in the tents, in the Ohel of shame? What's happened? What does a tent represent over here? The study houses. The study houses. We know that Yaakov, Yoshev Ahalim, Yaakov was in his tent. And that doesn't mean he was intense. Thanks for coming, you've been a great crowd. It means that he was very immersed in his learning. So now making a very unusual case. Follow carefully, we're going stage by stage. Now we're saying, the Torah's telling us, what Yafet did is going to end up really being very wonderful for themselves, because they're going to end up in the learning houses of shame of the Jewish people. Really? Do we see Greeks in the yeshivas of the Jewish people? And the answer is, well, maybe not Greeks, but Greek learning itself is going to come from this world. And there's something about the Greek language that even in Jewish law has great prominence. Look at the Gemara in Megillah on page 86. And the Gemara tells us that ancient Greek is the only foreign language with which it is permissible to write a Torah scroll. Now, I've not seen a Torah scroll in Greek, but that's what the halacha is. Greek has such wisdom and such beauty inside it. I use the word beauty for a reason, right? Yefet, beauty from Yafet, right? Yafet, Greek learning and discovery and information that we in the Western world are still reaping the beauty from, right? Whether it be architecture, whether it be the thought, the democracy, everything else, because remember, Greece eventually became Rome. But in its ideological state, right, it looks really good. Now, things are going to turn a little sour when various other Greek ideologies are going to end up ruining it for us, right? And there's going to be a few of them which are going to cause problems for the Jewish people, especially when they came to overtake Israel and started to create various laws that were antithetical to Jewish life. But it didn't start that way. It started well for the Jewish people. And the Gemara says, you can't write a Torah scroll in any other language besides Hebrew, except for Greek. Greek, oh, they got it right. Those Greeks, geniuses. They were something yafeh, beautiful, that they're allowed in the tents of shame, they're allowed into the tent of the learning houses, that they're allowed to even take our Holy Torah and to translate it. It may not be the best thing to do, but when they do, it's beautiful. And the Gemara then continues to say that this actually happened. Right? Under in Egypt, under the Greek ruler Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, in the 3rd century BCE, Ptolemy actually gathered together, famous story, you may have heard it before, 72 elders. Anyone heard the story before? This king, he separated out these, and he put them into 72 rooms. And he said to them, translate your Torah for me. Translate your Torah. I want this Torah to be written. Okay? And they sat down, and each of them in a separate room, without revealing why they were being summoned, entered the room to write the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay? They all came exactly in there. I think there were a few examples, Gemara tells us, where they miraculously ended up changing certain things which wouldn't reflect badly upon the people, but they matched each other. This is one of the great miracles, they say, that occurred, because these would have not reflected. This would not have reflected well for the Jewish people, and they did not. When we start translating things get translated, but they also get mistranslated and then used against us. So it's always a very, very arduous and terrifying task to translate our teachings and our Torah. Yeah. Greek. The central feature, says the Maharal, of Greek philosophy and ideas, okay, although Yafet wasn't part of that yet, but his descendants we're talking about, is wisdom. They want great wisdom. They love thinking. They love wisdom. That's what they want. This is very important information. You're not going to understand the Chanukah story, what happened to the Jews, unless you appreciate this. And this information is going to explain to you why they didn't initially try to just kill all the Jews, like the Romans did, right, and the Egyptians were doing before them. What they were trying to do was to enlighten us. It's when we didn't actually pick up on this enlightenment that things got a little bit hairy for the Jewish people. Says the Maharal, Lefikach ha'uma hazot, this nation, the Greeks, bakshu sheiktav lohem ha'chachma Torah, Yavanis, they wanted to have the Torah in Greek. Kamush first Megillah, the Megillah tells us. What does this teach us? Why do they want this? They didn't try to burn Torah scrolls. Did they? They didn't say, right, you Jews, stop learning Torah like so many nations. Because we love the Torah. We love it so much, we want to learn it with you. Give it to us in Greek. And the Chacham say, that's a great thing. I mean, maybe not initially, but the ability to have in Greek is actually because the Greeks have an appreciation for Torah wisdom more than any other nation. They get it. Greek philosophers, and the Rambam talks about Greek philosophers and say, Aristotle, he was incredible. Right? He was almost the level of a Navi. The wisdom was so incredible. So we don't look upon these Greeks like, oh, they're a bunch of it. No, we don't look at it that way. Right? It turned into that for other reasons. But initially, the idea of the Jewish idea and the Greek idea of learning and understanding and wisdom being spread among the people and books and learning, this was one we were in tandem with them. Right? Shem and Yafet, we're going to the original source of it, are working together to one goal. Different directions. We have a Torah, they don't. But they're like, oh, we want it. We want to have this information. And it's going to carry on like this for a while. Even when the Greeks eventually ended up in the land of Israel, as we're going to see, from Alexander Macedonia, is going to end up having a great relationship with the Jewish people as well. Chloe, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good.
How'd you sleep?
For a little too much.
You look well rested, yeah. Nice.
So it's like Jewish people live in Greece and then they grow up and that's their first language and then they read from the Torah on Shabbat. They're allowed to read it in Greek.
I listen. I can't go as far. No, Jewish people cannot. It has to be read from Torah, from a Torah scroll. The idea. I've never seen a Greek. I'm sure there were. The idea that they could take our Torah and put it into Greek. The Greek rabbis were saying there's something in Greek.
But you can't study the Torah in Greek.
Why not study Torah in English? Study Torah in French, in Russian. Study Torah in any language you want. But the original translating it onto a scroll and putting it down into Greek somehow, that works. We don't fully understand why, I'll be honest with you, but the rabbi said there's something about Greek philosophy and ideology. Again, we're halfway through a story, it's going to turn not so good, but that's how it started, yeah.
The whole reason why they're interested in this wisdom is because they were able to enter Shimon.
Because they acted a certain way, their ancestors acted a certain way, and this was somehow those two things are connected. We've not really connected them, but there was some connection between they acted in the tents with their father of modesty, that they were rewarded for this. The way they walked in with shame, yeah.
I don't
Okay.
get why Canaan was pregnant.
Well, different opinions. Some say he emasculated his father and treated him a certain way, and this trait seems to carry on in his descendants. That seems to be the consensus among the poskim. Says Rav Chaim Friedlander, he carries on, Yafet Elokim liyafet v'yishkal b'alei shem. We know the Torah tells us that the Yafet, the beauty, shall live with the sense of shame, and the beauty of Yavan, Yifiyos shel Yafet, yeh ba'olei shem. Shahare muta, it's permitted. Ratzui lishtamesh b'chetzonos Yafet. You see, it's permissible and desirable to use external beauty. You see, the Greeks, they love learning and they love beauty, right? The outside, right? They like the surface on the surface. I think it should look beautiful. They're very into beauty, right? From the buildings and the way they acted and the statues they started bringing up. Everything in the statues was very, very beautiful. You see statues, and even today, right? It's coming from Greek idea. Jews weren't building statues, right? This was not a Jewish idea. We're actually against it. It smacks of Avodah Zarah, potentially, right? But the Greeks were into that, right? They were the ones that created the Olympics. The original Olympics were performed in the nude, which, if you ask me, is a revolting thought, and makes the whole high jump a rather disgusting spectacle when you think about it. But I mean, that's the way it was, really. I'm just telling you, you see. So that's what they were into. They're into the external, you see. They were into the facade, right? Face. And the Jewish people were into the panim, which is panim, right? One is exterior, face facade, and then the interior. So they get beauty, not just the beauty of wisdom, but they enjoy beautiful things. Right? This was part of their whole ideology. And the Greek language was the language that helped them describe this. And so it had beauty as well. Right? It connected. And it was a tool that they used for obtaining the essence of things and the inner core. Just like Hebrew, right, in its essence is there to describe the essence of things, so too the Greek language had that ability. Right? So he says, "Kli ezer kalavush chitzoni," just like it helps to understand the outside, tachlit, and it gives you the ability, lepavnimich, she chachma Torah mitzvosa, right? Where's the wisdom? So they basically use it as a means to understand things. And the Gemara then tells how things started to change. Started well, but started to change. So that's what Greece was. And the Gemara tells a story, which is actually also found in the books of Josephus Flavius, in the book of Antiquities, chapter 11. And over there, we'll look at the Gemara's version, but it's the same version from Josephus, the Jewish historian who worked for the Romans. And the Gemara tells a really amazing story that happened when Alexander the Great, and he was called great because he was an incredible conqueror and a person who has tremendous wealth and thirst for knowledge and understanding. As well as that, he ended up taking over lots of countries, right? But his whole system was of learning and greatness. And when he arrived in Israel, however, there was a moment of panic, what he was going to do to the Jews. Just like any conquering army, are they going to work with the indigenous population, which is the Jewish people in Israel, or is he going to work against the indigenous population and kill them? And it was a very frightening night says the Gemara, on the 25th of Tevet. And it's known as the day of Mount Gerizim. But Esrim v'Chamishim Teves Yom Har Gerizim. And this day is considered to be a very happy day in the Jewish calendar. We don't really celebrate it today, but it's considered a happy day in the calendar. Such a happy day that we don't mourn on this day, says the Gemara. Why? Because something happened. You see, there were a group of people called the Kusim, the Samaritans, who did not have a good relation with the Jewish people and actually despised them. And they were living in Israel at the time. And they saw the entry of the Greeks at this time, which we discussed the dates of the last class, who were coming to Israel. They saw this as an opportunity to get rid of the Jews and the rabbis. They wanted to use this conquering army. I want to just point something out over here. We're going to talk about it more. You know, as children, we see, Chanukah. Well, first of all, we don't see it. We see it's just a funny holiday to, light some lights and have lots of gifts. Right? But even as we get a little bit deeper, see it as the war between the Greeks and the Jews. But it's a mistake to see it that way. It wasn't a war against the Greeks and the Jews. It was a war between the Jews, the Greeks, and then the Jews versus the Jewish Greeks. Many Jewish people sided with the Greeks. Actually, I'm going out on a limb when I say this. If this war were to happen today, okay, this ideological war, not just a physical, because there's ideological war as well that happened before the physical war kicked in, but it started with an ideology. If it happened today, I don't know how many Jewish people today would take the side of the Jewish people. I would hazard to guess, my friends, that if this Chanukah story happened today, most of the Jewish people would be on the Greek side. Which is a little ironic. We'll see why. It's a little ironic because all the Jews celebrate Chanukah. You're like, hey, I put a little, the bulb in your window, right, with a little Chanukah candle, right, and they're like bulbing in their little menorahs in the window, right, you see around town. But really, I'm not sure there's people who are doing that. I'm not putting them down, right? Everyone should light candles and enjoy Chanukah. It's a beautiful holiday. But if they understood why they're doing that, then people are like, yeah, I'd rather actually be on the side of the Greeks. It's a little ironic. Yeah. They were Jewish people, but they sided with the Greeks.
But there were Greek Jews.
They were Jews in Israel. But when the Greeks came in, they were enamored by their culture, as we know. There was a lot of beauty with it. And they felt more connected to that. They started to reject their Judaism and started to side with the Greeks against the rabbis.
So there were no Greek Jews?
No, not at that point. There were many years later. No, many years later. No, that's not that. We're talking about the Assyrian Greeks who came into Israel.
Okay.
Right. So Yom, yeah.
You said 25th of Tevet.
Yeah.
You start this left?
No, we're not talking about the story of Chanukah now. We're talking about a different day. This is not Chanukah's not happened yet.
Okay,
This is
but you said
pre-Chanukah.
it's a happy day.
We are pre-Chanukah. We haven't reached the Kislev. The 25th of Kislev is going to kick in many years later. Right now, Alexander the Great is coming to Israel, and the Kusim, the Samaritans, right, which referred to as the Good Samaritans, we see them as the bad Samaritans, right? They saw this opportunity to cause trouble for the Jewish people. So what happened? So it says. So the Gemara tells us, Yom Shavakshu, they wanted Kusim as Beis Elokeinu, Alexandria. They demanded actually from the Alexander the Macedonian, this Alexander the Great, that the house of God to be destroyed. They want to destroy the temple. They saw it as a theological threat against them, and they wanted to destroy it. Right? So the Gemara tells us that Alexander was sitting in this field of his encampment, and it was nighttime. And the Kusim had their plan to go up to Alexander the Great and to tell him, hey, the Jews are bad news, right? You don't want them here. Destroy their temple. So the Jews got wind of this plan of the Samaritans, and they're like, no, this isn't good. It says, Bo ve'odiu es Shimon Hatzadik. They went to, the rabbi went to Shimon Hatzadik, Simon the Righteous, who was the leader at that time, and they're like, Shimon, we're in big trouble. The Kusim, he's like, we got to go speak to Alexander. So all the rabbis came from the other side, and they lit their torches, and they went through this field in order to get to the side of Shimon Hatzadik Masa, Lavash Big Tekuna. So Shimon Hatzadik dressed up as the high priest. We'll see possibly why. V'nizatef Big Tekuna, and he wore the clothing of the priestly legion. Umikra Yisraelimo, and he went together with the Jewish people, and they went with torches in their hands. And that entire night, halalu, holchem mitzadzeh. Bahalu holchem mitzadzeh. So Alexander the Great is stationed over here in his encampment, and the Kusim are walking from this side during nighttime. Right, here are the Kusim, right, the Samaritans. They're coming through, and they want to tell Alexander, right, to go and destroy the temple. The Jews, however, are coming from the other side with Shimon Hatzadik, who's got torches in their hand, to try to speak to Alexander and try to get there before they do. Right, so there's this big meeting that's happening as Alexander the Great comes into town. And they walked all night until the dawn arose, says Gemara. Right? Ad she'ala amud hashachar. So there's a standoff in Israel with Alexander the Great, says the Gemara. And when the dawn rose, Alexander saw the Samaritans and said to his people, who are these people? Who are these Kusim? And they answered, Amrulo, Yodim Shemadubach. These are the Jews who rebelled against you. So he asked the Samaritans, and he said, who are these people? They said, oh, these are the Jews going to rebel against you. So it's not looking good. Right? As he reached Antipatris, right, a certain area there, the sun rose and they met. So now the Samaritans got there first, and they're like, these are the Jews, destroy them. And the Gemara says the following fascinating story. That Alexander saw Shimon Hatzadik, he gets off his horse, and he bows down to Shimon Hatzadik. Now this just didn't happen. It's extraordinary. Alexander the Great, right? He was called the Great for a reason. He's just conquered a nation, and there's this Shimon Hatzadik who's dressed up in the garb, right? The sun is going up, and he's there with all his rabbi friends, whoever they are. He gets up, so he bows down to them, which was extraordinary. And they said to him, Amrulo, Melech Gadol, a great king like you, Kamoscha, you're going to bow down to this Jew? And he said to them, Amalahem, let me tell you something amazing. Dumus duyukno shel zeh. I see this man, Shimon Hatzadik's face, every single time I'm about to go to war, and when I see his face, I know I'm going to win. And when I saw him, for real, I knew this was him, I had to bow down to him. The Gemara says, I know that his image leads me into victory in all my battles. Amalahem, he says to them, Lama Bata, what are you doing over here? What do you want from me? Amru, Efsha, Bayis, are you going to tell me, is it possible that idol worshippers, these Kusim, right? Are you telling me that the idol worship mislead you to destroy the house wherein we make prayers are said for you and your kingdom that should not be destroyed? These Kusim will destroy the temple. You know what we do? We pray for peace over the entire world. You want to destroy the house, the temple, that has kept you victorious? He said to them, who are these people? And they said, these are the Samaritans. The Kusim who are before you, they want to do this to you and to us. And he said, you can take them, do whatever you want with them. And he sided with the Jewish people. So amazing was this exchange between Alexander the Great, says the Gemara, and the Jewish people, Shimon Hatzadik, that the relationship was bonded between them. It was very, very strong. The Jews were free to carry on and felt protected while they were in Israel during this early phase of the Greek domination in Israel, to the point that every Jewish baby, I've mentioned last class, I think, that was born at this time, for 1 year, I believe, was given the name Alexander in memory of this event and this time. It was all good. Alexander the Great, however, died very young. Anyone know how old he was? 32 years old. He got a lot done before he was 32. No pressure. No pressure. Says Shimshon Fel Hirsch that actually the culture of Yavan and the culture of Israel was actually paths that met. Look at top page 89, it's in English. Follow inside, please. And it says like this: it was shown to Alexander the Great immediately with his first contact with Israel, this event we just spoke about, that even though he had been sent to bring all the countries of the East under the wings of the culture of Europe, he was doing coming from Europe, and he wanted to overtake the entire Middle East and to enlighten these savage barbarians and to give them life and to give them information, to give them wisdom. Right? They're still trying to do it. 2016. Despite this, there dazzled and illuminated his eyes, even in the Near East, on the very shores of the Mediterranean, he says, a culture that was greater, more elevated than his. So even though he came to bring his information to the Middle East, before he even pushed his way right through, he said, wow, these Jews, they got it. They have incredible, amazing wisdom. Against his will did Yefet bow to shame. So this bowing down that we spoke about from Yefet and shame, if you remember from the Pesukim that Yefet was going to bow down to shame, actually took place when Alexander the Great bowed down to Shimon Hatzadik. It's one example of it. And against his will he bowed down to shame, and the great Greek conqueror, he says, was no more than a scout who captured and prepared the ground for the spirit of Israel. So while he was alive, it was good. It was good. However, at the same time, encased in this beautiful world of Greek thought and ideology, for us, the Jewish people, there's a darkness. It's not all good. There's a danger that comes, and there's a certain line in the sand. Look at the famous Gemara. We actually go back to creation of the world. So we're going to predate Noah. And the Midrash, Bereishit Rabbah, tells us, 2:4, that Greek is also referred to as a primordial darkness, a very negative force. And it says, Shimon ben Lakish, right? Patar kriya begalius, va'aretz haytov v'vohu. The earth, he explains the verse that says, the earth was desolate and void, and darkness was on the face of the earth. Now, if you look through those verses, the rabbis see the 4 exiles inside those 4 verses. The Torah, obviously, is the blueprint of all the world in Jewish history. And if you look in the beginning of the Torah, all of history is kind of spawning from that point. And you can see the 4 galuts, the 4 exiles the Jewish people would have. So when you get to the words of darkness, says Reish Lakish, of Shimon ben Lakish, that's when you find the Greek exile, the Greek galut. Because remember, it was a galut. And there's a darkness, says Reish Lakish, Ze galut Yavan, Shechshicha, a name shel Israel, because these Greeks, they darkened the eyes of the Jewish people. Why? Why do they do this? Because they're a tehen, with their decrees. So let's put together. There's a lot going on over here. Just please focus with me. The rest of this course is not going to make sense. Greek ideology and philosophy is light. It brings light to the world. A Torah written in Greek, we love it. It works together. It's different, but we see beauty in it, and it sees beauty in us. And that's how it started. However, we see that we still were under galut, because eventually we're going to see the Greeks weren't satisfied just with appreciating the Torah. They wanted to eventually, when the people took over, the generals took over from Alexander the Great, came to conquer, and they wanted to overtake the Jewish thought, and eventually to have Greek philosophy be the dominating force and ideology in Israel. In order to do that, because the Jews were not buying, they had to make certain decrees upon the Jewish people. And these decrees were not pleasant in any way, shape, or form. So it's like any galut, any exile. It starts off well, like Yosef in Mitzrayim, right? He's the viceroy. The brothers come down. They're treated well, and they appreciate us, and they love us, and we work well with them. And eventually, it just carries on until it's not so good. And they're unhappy with us, and they want us to become more Egyptian, or in this case, more Greek, until we give up who we are as Jews. And the rabbis were not willing to do that. And then they start to fight us and battle us and to destroy us until we take it. And either we submit or we fight back. In the Greek story of Chanukah, we ended up fighting back, but it took a long time. So let's have a look at this piece of Chaim Friedlander. And he says, Afal Pikain, to Kufa Zunikra Galut Yavan. This time period when the Greeks were in Israel is still called a Galut, which means it's not good. Galut is not good. It's an exile. Although we're still in Israel, we were exiled. Ki Musa Galut, Eina B'davka Kasher Glinu Eretz Yisrael. You see, exile doesn't only mean when we're kicked out of Israel. It's not a physical movement alone. Kumosha Galut Babel, just like the Babylonian one, where they kicked us out of Israel, where Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple and kicked us out. He goes, that's not the only form of exile. Galut can mean two things. Galut can mean physical exile, but it can also mean ideological and spiritual exile as well. Here, they tried to push out Hashem Shechina, and they overtook Jewish life and Jewish Torah and mitzvah observance. And for this, right, as it were, Hashem was pushed out of the picture, and the Jewish people suffered very, very greatly. Dahainu, kasher kesher ruchni bein Am Yisrael l'Kadosh Baruch Hu, because there's a connection, spiritual connection between the Jewish people and God. It was chalash, it was weakened, u'menukah, and it seemed as though it was cut off. V'zot alidei shagoyim sholtem al Am Yisrael ofen ruchni, because they ended up hurting us, not just physically, but spiritually as well. Right? There was great assimilation at this time. Okay? That, he says, is considered a galut. Kasher hu moshpia mitruvasam u'makavanat ha'achalatzol lefi orchot ha'chaim shel hagoyim. Because what happens is, it's a situation where non-Jews rule over the Jews spiritually, and the Jews are influenced by the culture, and they end up preferring the non-Jewish culture to their own, and end up leaving their own culture. That, he says, is a big problem. Right? Turn over the page. So he says this is a contradiction, because we always saw Greece as light. Right? I'm going to keep using that word because we're going to end up being the way we fight it with light. But they try to, and it works in English, right? They try to enlighten us. That was the Greek idea. And it starts off well until they try to overtake our light, to darken and to extinguish our light. Where is the light of the Jewish people? Let's put this all together. Where is the light of the Jewish people? Where was it at the time of the temple? Somebody? Anybody? Where was the light? The menorah. The menorah was the light. What did the menorah represent for the Jewish people? What did the menorah represent? Was it a candelabra so we could eat by it? No. No, the menorah represented the light of Torah. So they tried to bring light. That was the Greek idea. Instead, they ended up bringing darkness to the Jewish people. Where was our light? Our light was in the Beit HaMikdash, right, in the temple. That was where our light was, in the form of a menorah. The menorah represented the light of the Jewish people. So now we begin to understand that when they wanted to darken the Jewish people, what did they do? They tried to extinguish the light. They didn't go to the houses and beat people up. They went into our temple and they defiled the oil and the light of the menorah. That was an ideological message to the Jewish people that the Judaism is over, we're extinguishing you, and now you're going to be sitting in darkness unless you take our own Greek ideology and light. Does that make sense? Are you seeing why the menorah and the temple ends up becoming the victim of the Greeks? Yeah? So the idea of Greece as darkness, page 90, please look inside, opposes what is accepted in the world and what is known from history of the Greeks, since the blossoming of enlightened human civilization was rooted in Greece. Right? You talk to anyone in the Western world, Greece was, we're studying Greek ideology, Greek philosophy, Greek thinkers, and there's something to it. There's greatness in it. There's no doubt about it. We Jews we don't deny that. The development of philosophy and science and culture, right, which they disseminated and they brought, actually imported through conquering to the rest of the world, right? And then ended up going down to the Romans, who carried on their ideology to great empires, right? All founded themselves on the wisdom of Greeks, and so did the Arabs, by the way. Many Arab cultures also took tremendous enlightenment from the Greeks, what they brought. It remains the basis of all science and culture. Right? When you study a lot of science, you're studying a lot of, Pythagoras' theorems and all the rest of it. All comes from Greece. It goes right back. Yet, Chachamim say, no, this is darkness. They brought darkness. Why is that? So the reason is, Elohi ha notenet. This is the reason. Since the Greeks were so scholarly, it was their intention to compete with the Torah's wisdom and with the nation of Torah, the Jewish people. It wasn't sufficient just to live alongside it. It became a competition, as it were, and they wanted to overtake it. And that's why the Maharal explains the Greeks wanted to destroy the special relationship between the God and the Torah, the Jewish people and the Torah, according to the principle that a strong nation is jealous, another strong nation, and therefore wanted to dispose of their Torah. They said, the Torah is fine. It's like, your Torah is not needed anymore. We'll be on new Torah. Right? So they weren't trying to kill us. They wanted to help us. In fact, the Greeks were wiser than other cultures, he says. They specifically viewed the Jewish nation as a threat to their stature. Their goal was to translate the Torah into Greek and to transform Judaism into some kind of subculture of Greece. That's what they wanted. However, there was one big problem that even the Jews had with Greek learning. You see, Greek learning was based upon observation. If you could see it, it's real. You can't see it, then we have nothing to do with it. Right? Just like we define science today. Science is all about observing and measuring and calculating and figuring out. And for us Jews, we love that. Right? There's a lot of Jewish doctors out there. But there's a point, however, that they were not willing to go over, and that was, in our view, from Jewish culture, the downfall. And the Ramban on Torah says the following. This is in Vayikra 16:8. He says, the scientists go in the way of Greeks, i.e. Aristotle. Remember, the Rambam said it was like incredible. However, there was a problem. They denied anything that was not observable. There was nothing of the spirit. It was all of form and function. Right? If it couldn't be felt and measured and understood, we want nothing to do with it. It doesn't exist. And eventually he says, since they weren't willing to accept anything that couldn't be through the senses, he and his wicked students were arrogant enough, he says, this is the Ramban speaking, Nachmanides, is not true. Now this was a problem with the Jewish people, because the Jewish people lived in a world that was based upon the observable world, which we put great respect in, but there's a spiritual world, a world of ruchni, of spirituality. Right? God is not physical in any way, shape, or form. Where if you look at Greek culture, their gods, which they had plenty, were very physical. Right? And they just sit up on Mount, like Scopas, like drink. They came down and they drank beer with the humans. And they were physical. Right? So their gods, of which they had plenty, were actually seen as lower than humans. And for us, we Jews, we weren't willing to buy into that. For us, the idea of godliness was always that which is otherworldly. That was Lamala min hateva. And what number represents Lamala min hateva? Above the physical? 8. 8 was the number that represented. Okay? So you should be putting the pieces together in your mind, because we're building up to the Chanukah story. They were all about 7, if you will. Right? The physical world, you can see it, understand it, and then go back to 1 again. And they did it really well, with great beauty. However, the Jewish people, were like, no, it's not just 7, there's an 8th dimension. There's a lamalim, there's above the natural order, there's a spiritual world. Okay? So that's the Rambam. And the commentary of Rav Chaim Friedlander says that Greek wisdom is the wisdom of human intellect, dealing with the sciences. They explored nature, and they became very accomplished in all these fields to rule over nature. Right? The scientific world that we Jews love. Right? We don't shy away from it. Right? We put great, love for doctors, especially if your kid becomes a doctor. There's no greater joy for a Jewish mother. Right? Right? Because that's an understanding of the world, and we Jews are into understanding them. However, one who's master over nature becomes master of the world and its inhabitants. Once you say that what I can see is everything, then I control it. Right? And anything else that happens becomes an observable fact. So I could look at water and say, well, everything, right, contracts. Every liquid contracts. And I understand. And then I see, oh, except water that expands in the form of ice. It's fine. So I don't say, well, that's an amazing thing. I guess to keep the fish alive. Right? They live under the ice during the winter. Like, no, that's just check off another fact. Right? Just if things are just put down into a little textbook and understood, right? All of life becomes encyclopedic. And we Jews think that's great, but some things are not understood. Right? There's a God, and God controls the world, and God made the world that you're observing, and God has to be appreciated. You have to see the beauty of God in the beauty of the world. That's the Jewish philosophy. I'm simplifying it, but that's basically it. So although he says it's permissible to utilize the world, nature, in order to use it, we don't shy away from the physical world. You can't rely upon it. All right? There's a God, and by doing that, you've disconnected God from the world. Right? Which doesn't have to be. Again, there's many great scientists to this very day who are observant Jews, right, who believe in God and still appreciate the world of science. So the Torah's teachings maintain there's a creation, and by the way, there's a big problem for them. Right? For them, the universe always existed. You realize that, right? As we call it the steady state theory. The world always existed, there was no beginning, no middle, and no end. And Jews are like, no, but we know the first verse of the Bible tells us, and it carried on like this for hundreds and thousands of years. Not hundreds and thousands, right? Hundreds and thousands of years. And the Jews came around and they said, no, there's a beginning, right? The first verse in the Bible. Until about 60 years ago, right? When those two scientists, Penzias and Wilson, right? Discovered the Big Bang. Right? And they discovered that now every scientist believes there's a beginning. Right? So like 60 years ago or so, whatever it was, all of scientific thinking went upside down and corroborated the first verse of the Bible. But for a long time, the Jewish people had big trouble, right? They were like, oh, you're so ignorant, you Jews, you believe there was a beginning. There's no beginning. The world's always been around. And now, there isn't a scientist who doesn't believe that. Now, who created the beginning, how it happened, what happened before the beginning, that's open for debate, right? We believe God did it, all right? I don't know what they believe. It just happened. So this was really the crux of the difference between the Greek and the Jewish nation. Okay? We did a lot today. For the remaining few minutes, because I don't want to move on to the next part. The next part's going to be the decrees against the Jewish people. I want to recap everything we did, because we did a lot. So let's just do that together, if you don't mind. Let's start with Sukkot. Only kidding. We started by talking about Noah had 3 sons. And we said somehow in that story, you're going to see the root of Greece. How? Because Noah, we said, ended up getting into a very uncompromising state of being drunk. That's how he related to his survival. And 2 of his sons, Yafet and Shem, after they were informed by Canaan, the other brother, what happened, by Ham, right, the father of Canaan, what happened? They decided to protect their father. And they did that. Somehow that act is the seed or the source or the representation of their descendants. And Shem eventually becomes the Jewish people. And we said that Yafet becomes the Greeks. And the Greeks, we're told, the Torah itself tells us, are going to live in the tents of Shem. Many years later, we see that. And we see that Yafet is going to bow down to Shem. Many years later, we see that Greek philosophy and ideology ends up blossoming and becoming a very beautiful, incredible thing. The Jews start to appreciate it. And it keeps growing. And then it reaches an apex where the two literally meet many years later. The descendants of Shem and Yafet meet in the form of Alexander the Great and Shimon Hatzadik on one fateful night in Tevet, in the middle of Israel, when Alexander the Great came and conquered the land. And there was a moment when the Jewish people looked like it was all over and he was going to destroy the temple. However, Shimon Hatzadik miraculously ended up saving the Jewish people, and Alexander the Great bowed down to him, which was the fulfillment of the original bowing down that Yafet was going to give to Shem. He said the Jews can stay. Alexander dies, and then we said something else happens. A darkness starts to form, and that darkness goes back to Bereshis, because we said the Choshech, right, that hovered over the earth at the beginning of creation is a reference to the Galut of Yavan. Why? We said they're amazing. They're in the tents of Shem. We have Torah, written in Greek even. Like, yeah. Because there's a point that they don't pass. They have great intellectualism, but they bring a darkness to the world and that they aren't willing to accept the spiritual world. Everything is physical, everything is observable, and we see in the creation of the sciences and mathematics, which is great, but it's all against measuring that which you can see. And they're very into the physical. That was the whole Olympics idea, right? It's ironic that, the Maccabean Games, right, are the Jewish Olympics, but the Maccabees were the ones who fought against that. Right? The Maccabees are the ones who are going to fight against the Greeks. They were against the whole ideology. It's a little ironic. I mean, the Maccabees represents the... You know what I'm saying? It's like... Anyway. So they start to impose this on the Jews. And what starts off as a nice relationship ends up bumping heads. And eventually we're going to see next class, they start to make decrees against the Jewish people, violating the Jewish people, taking their money, taking their wives, and stopping their mitzvah observance, the Torah study, because they said, you know what, you Jews are not buying into our system, so we're going to have to defeat it. And they came into our land to do it. It wasn't like we were living among them. They conquered Israel, and they started to, not Alexander the Great, but those who took over him, ended up doing that. So that ideological pinpoint that we see starts to really happen at this time. Yeah.
Can you go over again the meaning of the number 8?
So we're going to get to the number 8. We'll do half a class on number 8. The number, I didn't talk about this before in this class. The number 8 represents the mystical world. 7 is this world, 7 days of the week, 7 colors of the rainbow, 7 notes in a musical scale. 8 is the number following 7, represents the mystical world. And the number 8, this figure you see is not a Jewish symbol. It can't be coincidental that it happens to be the sign of infinity, right? But that's not a Jewish, that symbol is not a Jewish symbol. But the idea of 8-ness is always the mystical. Whenever you see 8, you're dealing with the mystical and the spiritual and, not the mystical, the above the natural order, right? The miraculous world and the spiritual world. So that's why Chanukah, as a response, somehow is going to involve light, because we have our own light, and it's going to involve 8 as well, and that's going to be the pushback against the Greeks. Yeah. It's going to be the ideological battle between the Jewish people who love wisdom, but think there's a God and there's a spiritual wisdom that surpasses the physical wisdom, or creates the physical wisdom, that works in tandem with it, and the Greeks who are like, no, right? There's plenty of gods, and they're all hanging out with us, and you know what? We're not so impressed by them. We've overtaken them. There is no wisdom greater than what we can see and define. That's really the root of it, as Ram defines it. Okay, I'm done. We'll pick this up, God willing, on Monday. Have a Shabbat Shalom.